Get up, man.
Dallas 911, this is Carla. Where's your emergency?
Hi, this is off-duty officer. I need EMS. I'm in number.
What's your address? Do you need police as well or just EMS?
Yes, I need both.
Okay, what's the address?
I'm at apartment number 1478.
It was a quiet evening in Dallas when Amber Geiger, a seasoned police officer, entered the wrong apartment. What happened next would send shockwaves through the community, the nation, and change the course of two families' lives forever. But was it truly a tragic mistake? Or was something darker at play? As the courtroom drama unfolded, questions about race, power, and accountability took center stage. What happened that night? And who was really to blame? Botham Shem Jean was born on September 29, 1991, in Castries, the capital of the island nation of St. Lucia. His parents, Allison and Berthina Jean, were deeply religious and members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Raised in such a faith-driven environment, Botham's upbringing instilled in him strong moral values, including honesty, tolerance, and a desire to help others. These qualities were noted by many who knew him in his lifetime. From a young age, Botham stood out among his peers. His parents raised him with a strong sense of responsibility and a focus on education. In school, he demonstrated exceptional abilities in mathematics and music. At a young age, Botham began singing in the church choir, where his deep and moving voice immediately caught attention. Music became an important part of his life, and the church was a place where he felt supported and confident. After finishing school, Botham decided to continue his education in the United States. He chose to attend Hardin-Simmons University in Texas, where he pursued a degree in accounting. This decision marked an important milestone in his life, as moving to the U.S. opened up new opportunities for professional growth and personal connections. After graduation, Botham secured a job as an accountant in Dallas. His career quickly flourished, and his colleagues highly valued his professionalism and approach to work. For Botham, working at PwC wasn't just a career step. It was an opportunity to contribute to society and provide for his family. He supported his parents, helped the youth in his community in St. Lucia, and dreamed of advancing further in his career. His coworkers remembered him as someone who always brought positivity and inspiration to the team, fostering a strong sense of camaraderie and striving for the best results. But it wasn't just his professional life that mattered to Botham. He was actively involved in the life of his church in Dallas, where he was part of the music group and often spent time with friends from the community. He found joy in simple things, cooking dinners for his friends, organizing parties to maintain friendships, and always sharing his sincere smile and support with others. His life was filled with plans for the future, full of optimism and a drive to achieve even greater things. Amber Geiger, on the other hand, came from a small town near Dallas. She was born on August 9th, 1988, and grew up in a family where discipline and hard work were strongly emphasized. From an early age, Amber dreamed of becoming a police officer. Her father worked in local law enforcement, and she knew she wanted to follow in his footsteps to help people and bring order to society. Amber pursued this dream after high school by enrolling in the police academy. She worked hard and demonstrated the discipline and focus needed for a career in law enforcement. After graduating from the academy, Amber began her career with the Dallas Police Department, where she eventually became an officer. Her colleagues described her as determined and hardworking, though she often expressed frustration with the emotional strain and high stress of her job. The life of a police officer is always filled with risk and stress, and Amber was no exception. She often found herself in situations that required quick decisions, where her reaction had to be immediate. These working conditions took a toll on her emotional state. Over time, she became more withdrawn and cautious in her relationships with others, preferring to spend her free time alone to recharge. Amber Geiger was dedicated to her profession, but her life was full of contradictions. She tried to hide her vulnerabilities, but those who knew her well could see that she often felt lonely and sometimes even lost in the world. Despite her strong and determined character, her internal struggles and fatigue from the constant pressure made her life less stable. She would often return home late, exhausted and emotionally drained, which perhaps played a critical role in the tragic events that unfolded later. After moving to Dallas, Amber bought an apartment in a high-rise building not far from her workplace. She hoped that living close to her job would help her rest more and not waste too much time on commuting. Life in Dallas was supposed to be a fresh start for her, but this new beginning didn't bring the peace she had hoped for. Work, stress, and emotional strain became part of her daily routine. She often found it hard to manage the growing exhaustion, which led to tension and personal issues in her life. September 6, 2018, started for Botham Jean just like any other day. He woke up early in the morning as usual and headed to his office in downtown Dallas. It was another busy day, filled with meetings, discussions, and preparing reports for clients. Botham was someone who always strived to do his best at work, and this day was no different. His colleagues noticed his upbeat mood and the smile he shared with those around him. No one could have predicted that this would be the last day of his life. After work, Botham returned to his apartment in the Southside Flats complex, located in the heart of Dallas. His apartment was his sanctuary, a place where he could unwind after a long day. That evening, Botham decided to keep things simple. He planned to cook dinner, play his favorite music, and relax. He loved cooking, and it was one of his ways to relieve the stress of his workday. Meanwhile, Amber Geiger was finishing a 13-hour shift at the police station. That day had been especially grueling for her. Numerous calls, patrolling, and paperwork had completely worn her out. She felt a fatigue that seemed to weigh down her entire body, and all she wanted was to get home as quickly as possible. When her shift finally ended, Amber headed home, eager to collapse into bed and rest. However, her exhaustion and emotional depletion would play a pivotal role in the tragic events that were about to unfold. Amber arrived at her apartment complex where she lived on the 3rd floor. On her way to her apartment, her attention was distracted as she was scrolling through messages on her phone, reflecting on the day she had just experienced. At some point, she accidentally rode the elevator to the 4th floor instead of her own. The doors to the apartments in this building were similar, and in her tired state, she didn't notice that she had approached the wrong unit. The door to Botham Jean's apartment was slightly ajar, which immediately made her suspicious. In her exhaustion and confusion, she thought someone might have broken into her apartment. Amber drew her service weapon without considering the potential consequences. The only thought in her mind was that she needed to protect herself. She pushed the door open and entered. Inside, Botham, who was preparing dinner in his apartment, heard the noise. He turned toward the door, unsure of what was happening. Amber, seeing a figure inside, mistook him for an intruder and without hesitation fired twice. The shots echoed through the quiet apartment, and within moments, Botham fell to the floor. Amber turned on the lights and only then realized her mistake. She saw an unfamiliar man lying in a pool of blood, and it hit her that she had entered the wrong apartment. Panic and horror overwhelmed her. She rushed to Botham, trying to administer first aid. She called 911, explaining the situation to the operator, desperately trying to explain that she had entered the wrong unit and had shot someone. Her voice trembled with fear and regret as she pleaded with Botham to hold on, repeatedly saying she hadn't meant for this to happen. While waiting for emergency services to arrive, Amber attempted to stop the bleeding, but her efforts were in vain. Neighbors, who had heard the gunshots and cries, began to step into the hallway. Some of them also called the police, reporting the gunfire in the apartment complex. Paramedics arrived at the scene and tried to save Botham, but his injuries were fatal. That evening, the life of a young man with so many hopes and dreams was tragically cut short. Amber Geiger was detained at the scene. She appeared to be in a state of shock, completely disoriented, repeating that she hadn't meant for this to happen and that it was a mistake. She was taken to the police station for questioning. The police launched an investigation to understand how this tragedy unfolded. There were many questions. Why hadn't Amber realized she was not in her own apartment? Why had she resorted to using her weapon without confirming that there was an actual threat? These questions became central to the investigation and sparked intense public debate. As investigators gathered evidence, the public began to actively discuss the incident. The case sparked a massive outcry, especially in the context of racial issues and concerns about police abuse of power. Botham Jean was Black, and many saw his death as yet another example of unjust treatment and bias by law enforcement. People began to ask, did Botham's race play a role in Amber mistaking him for an intruder and shooting him without attempting to assess the situation? Meanwhile, Botham's family was devastated by the events. His mother, Allison Jean, was in St. Lucia when she learned of the tragedy. It was a crushing blow for her. Her son, who had moved to the U.S. to build a better life, was killed in his own apartment. Allison began to demand justice for her son, calling on the public and authorities for a thorough and impartial investigation. She knew Botham as a kind, responsible, and hardworking person who posed no threat to anyone. In the days following the incident, there was a flood of contradictory reports and rumors. The media extensively covered the case, and public opinion was deeply divided. Some believed Amber had made a tragic mistake, while others argued her actions were the result of bias and an inability to properly assess the situation. Protests and rallies began in Dallas and other cities, with people taking to the streets demanding justice for Botham Jean and his family. During the investigation, it was revealed that Amber Geiger had been exhausted after a long shift and may have been disoriented due to her fatigue. Her defense attorneys argued that she acted in a state of stress and fear for her life. However, the prosecution maintained that her actions were inexcusable for a police officer who should be able to control their emotions and make sound decisions, especially in situations involving the use of a weapon. Witnesses who lived in the apartment complex testified that they heard screams and gunshots. Some of them tried to figure out what was happening, but no one expected such a tragic outcome. Investigators collected evidence, reviewed surveillance footage, and analyzed testimonies to reconstruct the full picture of the events that day. They were trying to determine whether this was truly a tragic mistake, or if other factors contributed to such a devastating outcome. After Amber Geiger's arrest, the case entered a new phase, a lengthy and complex process of investigation and trial preparation. Amber was charged with manslaughter. During the investigation, her attorneys argued that her actions were a tragic but unintentional mistake, caused by extreme exhaustion following a long shift. However, the prosecution maintained that Amber's actions were unacceptable for a trained police officer who is expected to assess situations carefully and avoid unnecessary use of force. One of the key pieces of evidence was footage from the surveillance cameras at the apartment complex where both Botham Jean and Amber Geiger lived. These recordings helped reconstruct the events of that night. The cameras captured Amber arriving at the building and entering. The footage showed her going to the wrong floor and approaching an apartment that belonged to Botham. Investigators pointed out that she failed to exercise due diligence and did not notice she was on the wrong floor. In addition to the video evidence, phone records played a significant role in the case. Shortly before the incident, Amber had been texting with a colleague with whom she had a personal relationship. Prosecutors argued that these messages might have distracted her and contributed to her failing to realize she was entering the wrong apartment. The defense, however, downplayed the importance of the texts, claiming they were unrelated to the incident and could not have influenced her actions. Over the course of several months, investigators continued gathering evidence and interviewing witnesses. Neighbors in the apartment complex provided statements about hearing shouts and gunshots. Some claimed they heard voices before the shots were fired, suggesting there may have been an exchange between Amber and Botham prior to the tragic event. However, witness testimonies varied, making it difficult to piece together a definitive account of what happened. At the same time, forensic examinations were conducted. Experts meticulously analyzed the firearm used in the shooting, as well as the bullet trajectory and other physical evidence, to determine the positions of Amber and Botham at the time of the shooting. One contentious point was the positioning of Botham's body and the angle of the bullet. The prosecution argued that the evidence showed Botham did not pose a threat to Amber, while the defense claimed she acted out of self-defense. In August 2019, a highly publicized trial began, attracting widespread attention from both the public and the media. The courtroom was packed with journalists, family members, and friends of Botham Jean, as well as supporters of both the prosecution and the defense. The case promised to be a difficult one, touching on issues of police competence, personal responsibility, and racial justice. The trial opened with statements from both the prosecution and the defense. Prosecutors argued that Amber Guyger's actions were not just a mistake, but the result of her negligence as a police officer. They emphasized that any officer should exercise heightened caution, especially when it comes to using a firearm. Furthermore, they pointed out that Botham Jean was in his own home and posed no threat to Amber. The defense, on the other hand, built its case around the idea that Amber was acting out of extreme exhaustion and confusion, driven by fear for her own safety. Her attorneys sought to portray her as someone who made a tragic mistake without any malicious intent. They also highlighted her previously unblemished record in law enforcement, hoping to elicit sympathy from the jury. Over the course of several weeks, witnesses, experts, and family members of both the defendant and the deceased testified. One of the most emotional moments of the trial came when Botham's mother, Allison Jean, took the stand. She spoke about her son's dreams and plans for the future, describing him as a kind and compassionate person. Her words deeply moved everyone in the courtroom, emphasizing the tremendous loss her family had endured. Also testifying was Botham's brother, Brant Jean, whose statement became one of the most talked about moments of the trial. In his address to the court, he publicly forgave Amber Guyger and even asked for permission to hug her. This gesture sparked a range of reactions. Some saw it as an incredible act of kindness and Christian forgiveness, while others felt that such an action should not overshadow the need for fair justice. Among the evidence presented in court were surveillance footage and an audio recording of Amber's 911 call after the shooting. In the recording, she can be heard in a panic, repeatedly stating that she had entered the wrong apartment and never intended to kill anyone. This call sparked further discussion, as it captured her desperation, but also highlighted the lack of any attempt to determine who was in front of her before resorting to using her weapon. The expert testimony focused on analyzing the trajectory of the bullet, the position of Botham Jean's body, and the circumstances surrounding the shooting. Experts for the prosecution argued that the bullet's path suggested Botham was in a relaxed position, likely sitting or standing up from his couch when he was shot. This contradicted the defense's claim that he had been moving toward Amber and posed a threat. However, the defense attempted to discredit these conclusions, stating that the trajectory could not be conclusively determined due to a lack of data. Throughout the trial, the public closely followed the developments of the case. Protests and rallies continued, with activists calling not only for a fair sentence for Amber Guyger, but also for police reform to prevent similar incidents in the future. There were widespread calls for changes to police training, especially regarding decision-making skills in high-stress situations, and for greater accountability for mistakes that lead to tragic outcomes. Amber Guyger also took the stand, describing the events of that night from her perspective. She explained how she had come home after a long shift, feeling tired and disoriented. She claimed that she genuinely believed she was in her own apartment and thought Botham was an intruder who had broken into her home. She cried as she spoke, stating that she never intended to harm anyone and that it was a terrible mistake, one that she would have to live with for the rest of her life. Her testimony was emotional and, in the opinion of some, sincere, though it sparked conflicting reactions among the audience. The question of what the appropriate sentence should be became central in the final stage of the trial. Prosecutors insisted that Amber Guyger should be convicted of manslaughter, arguing that her actions led to the death of an innocent person and that a police officer who cannot assess a situation properly should not remain on the force. The defense, on the other hand, requested a lighter sentence, citing the lack of intent and arguing that Amber already carried a heavy burden of guilt for her mistake. After several days of deliberation, the time finally came for the jury to render their verdict in the case of Amber Guyger. Tension filled the courtroom as all eyes were on the judge and jury, who would decide whether the former police officer was guilty of causing Botham Jean's death. For many, this trial had become a symbol not just of a personal tragedy, but also of the deep-rooted issues within American society: racial bias, abuse of power, and a lack of accountability within law enforcement. On October 2, 2019, the jury announced their verdict. Amber Guyger was found guilty of the crime that resulted in Botham Jean's death. This decision came as a surprise to many, particularly since the prosecution had initially sought a conviction for manslaughter. The charge of murder carried more serious consequences and a longer prison sentence. In the courtroom, there were audible expressions of relief and quiet celebrations. This verdict was a significant step toward justice for Botham's family and those who had supported them throughout the long and painful trial. The following day, the judge delivered the sentence. Amber Guyger was sentenced to 10 years in prison. In her statement, the judge acknowledged the complexity and tragedy of the case, emphasizing that both sides had experienced significant loss. Guyger, the judge noted, had made a grave error that cost an innocent person his life. However, despite the weight of the sentence, many felt that 10 years was too lenient for a life lost as a result of such a severe mistake. While some were satisfied with the court's decision, others believed it fell short. Activists and supporters of the Jean family argued that the sentence did not reflect the gravity of the crime and was not enough punishment for the life that had been taken. Protests continued in Dallas and other cities, with many calling for further reforms in the criminal justice and law enforcement systems. This case became a symbol of the fight for justice and brought renewed attention to the challenges Black Americans face in interactions with law enforcement. Amber Guyger herself remained in shock following the verdict and sentencing. She repeatedly stated that she had no intention of harming anyone and that it was a terrible mistake. Her attorneys filed an appeal, hoping to reduce her sentence. They argued that 10 years was too harsh for someone who acted out of confusion, stress, and exhaustion. However, as the trial concluded, Guyger was taken into custody to begin serving her sentence. Botham Jean's family expressed their gratitude to everyone who supported them throughout the long months of the trial. Botham's mother, Allison Jean, stated that while the verdict provided some sense of resolution, it could never bring back her son. She emphasized the need for systemic reforms in the justice system and law enforcement to prevent similar tragedies from happening again. Allison continued to advocate for change within police departments, hoping her son's case would serve as a catalyst for meaningful progress. The case of Botham Jean had a profound impact on public opinion and the national conversation around policing. This incident became yet another example highlighting systemic issues in law enforcement and the treatment of Black citizens. In response to public pressure, several states began considering legislative initiatives aimed at improving police training, particularly in situations involving the use of force and community interactions. Calls grew louder for increased accountability for officers' actions and mandatory training programs focused on racial and cultural competency. Additionally, Botham Jean's case inspired the creation of organizations and funds dedicated to supporting families of victims of police misconduct and advocating for law enforcement reform. These groups provided legal and emotional support while spearheading campaigns to raise awareness about racial discrimination and abuse of power. Allison Jean became an active participant in these initiatives, using her personal story to fight for justice and systemic change. As time passed, Amber Guyger continued to serve her sentence in prison while awaiting the outcome of her appeal. This case not only shattered the lives of two families, but also left a lasting mark on American society. The tragic mistake that led to Botham Jean's death served as a stark reminder of the need for reform and the importance of law enforcement officials making sound and responsible decisions, especially in life and death situations. The story of Botham Jean and Amber Guyger remains one of the most discussed and impactful cases in recent U.S. history. It underscores the profound consequences of poor judgment, particularly when exercised by those in positions of power. While justice, according to many, was only partially achieved, the case left unanswered questions and became a symbol of the ongoing fight for equality and accountability in America.